Hello, students. Welcome to the online classes with Tina Motwani. And the lesson that we are going to take up today is A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot. And I'll be giving you a detailed analysis of this particular lesson. Now, A Triumph of Surgery has been written by James Herriot. James D. Herriot, known by the pen name James Herriot, was a British veterinary surgeon and writer. He had written a series of 8 books from 1930s to 1950s in England about animals and their owners. And this particular account is also based on his real life experience, and his other works include All Things Bright and Beautiful, If Only They Could Talk, Every Living Thing, etc. Now we'll see certain words which are difficult in the story. It'll be easier for you to make out their meanings. Relent, abandon or mitigate a severe or harsh attitude. To lessen the harshness of someone's attitude is relent. Lumbago. Lumbago is muscular pain in the lower part of the back. Drooping, bending or hanging downwards. Distraught, extremely worried. Distraught, extremely worried. Bouts, short period of intense activity of a specific kind. Bouts are activity, means short period of intense activity. Panting, out of breath. Panting is out of breath. Soon, faint. Soon is to faint, especially from extreme emotion. Sausage, an item of food in the form of a cylindrical length of minced pork or other meat encased in a skin, typically sold raw to be grilled or fried before eating. And you have an expression, an idiomatic expression, which is related to this word sausage, silly sausage, an affectionate form of address, especially to a child, like silly sausage, he teased. Then rheumi, a watery discharge from a mucous membrane, especially of the nose or eyes. Rheumi. Lolled. Now, loll is to hang or sit or lie or stand in a lazy, relaxed way. Lolled. Hastened, from the word haste, doing something quickly. So, hastened, being quick in doing something. Malnutrition, lack of proper nutrition or feeling weak. Kick, strength or energy. Pack, a group of wild animals. Trotted out. To trot out is to lead out or to move around briskly. Engulfed. Engulfed meaning surrounded or overwhelmed. Now, pine. Pine is long for something, desire for something. Pathetic, arousing pity or sadness. Pathetic scene. Wailing, crying with pain, grief, or anger. Gasping, catch one's breath with open mouth. So, gasping is catching one's breath with open mouth owing to pain or astonishment. It can be because of pain or astonishment. Now, sloped, spill over. Sloped is spill over. Scrimmage, a confused struggle or fight. Scrimmage is a confused struggle or fight. Bowled over, greatly astonished or surprised. Tramped on, walked heavily or noisily. So tramp on means walk heavily. Shaggy, untidy, hair or fur that is long and untidy. Hovered, to hover is to remain in one place in the air, hanging in the air sort of. Dodge, now dodged or dodge is to avoid by a sudden or quick movement. Dodge. Convalescing, recovering from an illness. Convalescing is recovering from an illness or recuperating. Chauffeur, a person hired to drive a privately owned car. No, in general language, we say driver. So it's a chauffeur, a person hired to drive a privately owned car. Light, flexible. Light is flexible. swarmed of flying insects forming a swarm, means coming in group, like insects come in group, so that we call swarm. Now we will have a look at the characters in the story. Mrs. Pumphrey, a rich mistress. Tricky, a small dog, pampered and overfed by his mistress. Mr. Herriot, a veterinary surgeon. Veterinary surgeon is a surgeon who is performing surgery on animals. Hawkin is the gardener. So, students, now I'll be narrating the story to you, and that too in present tense. If you are narrating a story or writing a story in past tense, then throughout you have to maintain that tense only. And if it can be done in present tense also, then from the beginning to the end, you have to just take care of this fact that you are using present tense. A triumph of surgery is all about a dog named Tricky, his rich mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, and a veterinary, Mr. Herriot. The story revolves around the dog who's overfed and pampered by his mistress. Now, Tricky is a greedy dog, so much so that he never refuses food, cream cakes, and chocolates with minimal exercise. As a result, he becomes hugely fat, making him unable to walk and run. One day, Mrs. Pumphrey and Mr. Herriot meet coincidentally on a street. Mr. Herriot explains to Mrs. Pumphrey about Tricky's condition and warns her about Tricky's state of affairs and advises her to take Tricky regularly for exercise and a proper diet. After a few days, Tricky falls ill, and Mrs. Pumphrey calls Mr. Herriot to rush to her place to investigate Tricky as he has stopped eating and moving. Now, Mr. Herriot takes Tricky to his place for treatment, and he already knows that Tricky is not ill but overfed. That has made him lackadaisical. So he gives him nothing to eat but only plenty of water to drink for 2 days. Now, Tricky starts recovering for after a period of 2 days and gradually starts eating and playing with other dogs at Mr. Herriot's place. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey keeps sending eggs, wine, and brandy for Tricky's speedy recovery, but these commodities are not given to Tricky as these are relished by Mr. Herriot and his staff. Now, during all this period, Mrs. Pumphrey keeps asking Mr. Herriot about Tricky's condition. And Mr. Herriot wants to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. Why? Because the supplies are plenty and luxurious. After a fortnight, Mrs. Pumphrey goes to Mr. Herriot's place to take Tricky home as she is informed by Mr. Herriot that Tricky has completely recovered from illness and is fit to go home. Now, while bidding adieu to Mr. Herriot, Mrs. Pumphrey cried from her car, "Oh, Mr. Herriot, how can I ever say thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." But only Mr. Herriot knew that he never performed a surgery on Tricky. All Tricky needed was proper guidance and a routine of proper diet and exercise to recuperate from his miserable condition, and Mr. Herriot provided that. So, what is the message that we get from the story? There are several things. First thing, we should maintain a balance between eating and workout. Excess of everything is dangerous. Everything should be in a proper quantity. Then there is sufficient for everyone's need but not greed. Your needs can be fulfilled, but no one can give you sufficient to fulfill your greed. And then there's one more message: spare the rod and spoil the child. That is relevant for the parents also, that if they are not keeping a check over their children, if they are not training their children to lead a balanced life, then their children will be spoiled. So they should not be over pampered by the parents. So these are different things which we learn from the story. That's all. Thank you.